Take off my ring. You were never good enough for my family.
You're a gold digger, get out!
Don't you dare speak to her like that. Not another word.
You just humiliated the woman I crossed an ocean to meet.
Chapter 1. The Night the Ring Came Off. Your father trusted me with this family's legacy. I'm just making sure it outlasts all of us. Simone Whitfield walked into that Wednesday dinner, believing she was still the woman Damian Cole had chosen, still the daughter her father raised to handle anything New Orleans could throw at her. She walked out without a ring, without a fiancé, and without the one attorney who had spent his final weeks figuring out that someone was trying to steal the most valuable thing her family had ever owned. What Damian Cole did not count on was the $200 million yacht that arrived in the marina that same night, carrying a man who had been asking very precise questions about the Whitfield waterfront land for months. This is a story about what happens when a woman who has been loyal to the wrong person finally decides to be loyal to herself, and what she finds when she stops waiting on the truth and goes out looking for it. It is also a story about what is owed to the people who built before us and to the people standing beside us now. The Pontchartrain Train Club's private dining room was beautiful in the way that rooms built by a certain kind of money for a certain kind of purpose become beautiful over time, not because of the crystal or the white tablecloths or the chandelier that broke its light into small pieces across every surface, but because of the accumulated weight of all the decisions that had been made inside it. 40-some members of the New Orleans Black Business Alliance were gathered there that Wednesday in October, and the sound they made together was low and deliberate, the sound of people who knew each other well enough to be careful about what they said out loud, and who had learned that the unspoken things in a room like this one traveled faster than the spoken ones. Simone Whitfield had been coming to events in rooms like this since she was 7 years old. First in the Sunday shoes her mother picked out for her, and then in the shoes she chose for herself, which were considerably better and considerably more expensive, and carried with them the precise confidence of a woman who had earned her own taste. She was wearing the charcoal dress tonight, the one with the asymmetrical collar, the birthday gift from her mother that she had been saving for the right occasion. She had decided this was the right occasion. She had been wrong about what kind of occasion it would turn out to be. Damian Cole sat 2 seats to her left, with his hand resting easy on the white tablecloth, and the expression on his face that she had spent 2 years reading as warmth and was about to understand, finally, for what it actually was. He had checked his watch 3 times since the main course was served. Twice he had caught Commissioner Harold Fontaine's eye across the table and held it a fraction too long, the eye contact of 2 men who have confirmed something and are waiting for the right moment to move on it. Simone had noticed all of this the way she noticed most things, which was quietly, and filed it and waited. She had met Damian 18 months after her father's funeral. Augustus Whitfield Gus, to everyone in this room, to most of this city, had died on a Thursday in late spring, and the grief of it had been the first thing every morning, solid and present before the coffee finished brewing, before the day had organized itself into the list of things that needed her. Damian had walked into a charity auction at the New Orleans Museum of Art with a quiet gravity that her friends had seen before she did, and he had been patient in the months that followed, and consistent and there-ness for a woman who had been managing an estate and a company, and her own sorrow mostly alone for 14 months, had felt like something close to grace. She had let herself trust it. She had let herself love him. She had worn his grandmother's ring for 7 months. The dessert plates were cleared. The glasses were refilled. The room settled into that amber hour between the end of a formal dinner and the beginning of departures, and Damian Cole stood up. The room gave him its attention the way this community had been giving the Cole family its attention for 30 years, reflexively, out of accumulated habit, without deciding to. He had his father's voice, warm and unhurried, carrying the register of a man who has never had to rush a sentence to make sure a room was still with him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want to speak to something that has been weighing on my heart, and I believe on Simone's heart as well for some time now. I know how much everyone in this room loved Gus Whitfield. He was a man who built something real in this city. He trusted this community with what he built. He trusted my father. And when Simone and I came together, he told me personally that he trusted me to honor what he had built." He paused, and the pause was exactly as long as it needed to be. "Your father trusted me with this family's legacy. I'm just making sure it outlasts all of us." He turned towards Simone, and the look in his eyes did the thing she now understood. It had always been doing it, checked whether she was going to make this difficult. "For the sake of the Whitfield legacy, and for both our futures, I believe this engagement needs to come to a close." The room went quiet, not the quiet of shock, because these were not people who shocked easily, the quiet of a room full of black professionals who have just watched something ugly get done in expensive language, and who are each simultaneously calculating what they witnessed and what it will cost them to name it. Marcus Pruitt, who had been the Alliance's legal counsel for 12 years, and who was one of the shrewdest men in that room, set his fork down very slowly on his plate and looked at the white tablecloth. He was not a man who looked at tablecloths. Patricia Bordeaux reached under the table and found her friend Della's hand without looking at her. The woman seated beside Commissioner Fontaine turned slightly in her chair, away from the table, as if she needed a moment of private air. And from the back corner of the room, Sister Ida Young, 76 years old, who had known Gus Whitfield since the 1980s, who had sat in the front pew at his funeral, and who had spoken truth plainly in public rooms for her entire adult life, said in a voice too clear and too measured to be anything other than deliberate, "Lord have mercy." She said it the way churchwomen say it when they mean, "I see you. I see what just happened." "This is on record now." Damian said more sentences. He used the word legacy 3 more times and the phrase "what your father would have wanted" twice, and he did not say love, not once, not in any form. The language he used was entirely the language of a man describing an asset management decision. Every person in that room who had known the Whitfield family for more than 3 years understood exactly what they were hearing. Simone picked up her water glass. She took a long, measured sip. Her mother had given her this, the ability to put something in her hands when her hands needed something to do, and to drink slowly enough that the time she bought herself looked like composure instead of recovery. She set the glass back on the white tablecloth without making a sound. She looked at Damian Cole for exactly 1 second, and what she saw in his face in that second was the thing she had been refusing to see for 2 years, which was not love, and had never been love, but was instead the practiced expression of someone who had decided what the outcome was going to be, and was waiting to see whether she would cooperate. She said, in a voice that traveled to every corner of that dining room without being raised a single degree, "Thank you for the clarity, Damian." She pushed back her chair. She stood. She smoothed the front of the charcoal dress her mother had given her. Across the table, Marcus Pruitt raised his eyes from the tablecloth and watched her walk out with an expression that held respect and something very close to shame, but not for her. The anteroom was cool and quiet, and Simone crossed it without slowing, and she would have made it out the door and to the parking structure and into the privacy of her car, before she let herself feel any of it, except that through the long glass wall facing the waterfront, she saw the yacht. It was coming into the marina slowly, and the word yacht was not quite right for something that sized 200 meters of white steel, lit from the waterline, moving through the dark water with the silence of something that had made peace a long time ago with its own power. It glided to berth at the private slip at the far end of the dock with a precision that looked natural and was not. The name on the hull in clean white letters, Bequois, Kang Pacific. Commissioner Harold Fontaine materialized at her elbow with the ease of a man who had been inserting himself into other people's important moments. For so long he had stopped recognizing that was what he was doing. Jisoo Kang himself, aboard, been trying to get him here for months. Last-minute addition tonight, I just got the confirmation this afternoon. He glanced back toward the dining room, and she could feel him deciding whether to say something about what had just happened in there. She held her expression even. He made the right choice. Come on, let me introduce you. Jisoo Kang was on the lower terrace with two members of his team and the Port Authority liaison officer when Harold brought her over. She registered him the way you register someone who is fully present in a room, not performing it, not working at it, just there, with a complete kind of attention that she recognized because she was accustomed to being around people who had that quality, and because it was rarer than anyone who had it understood. He was in a dark suit made specifically for him, the kind of tailoring that does not call attention to itself, but that you could read if you knew what to look for. He was slim and composed, with the stillness of a man who had been through enough difficulty that his default state had resolved itself not into peace, but into something more honest than peace, which was discipline. He was listening to the liaison officer. When Simone and Harold arrived, he finished listening before he redirected his attention. She noted that too. Damien arrived, of course, with two board members, and the warmth he reserved for men he needed something from. Mr. Kang, Damien said, hand extended, the Cole family has 30 years in this maritime corridor. We know every dock, every easement, every relationship that matters. Whatever the port needs, we want to be in that conversation. He gestured toward Simone with the ease of someone indicating a thing that is adjacent to them. You may know the Whitfield name, adjacent waterfront parcels. The family is still working through the estate. Still working through, Jisoo said. He shook Damien's hand without breaking his attention from Simone. After how long? These things take time, Damien said. Complex estate. Jisoo looked at Simone. Not at Damien, not at Commissioner Fontaine, not at the view from the terrace, at Simone. Miss Whitfield, he said, and her name in his mouth had a directness that felt, in contrast to everything that had just happened in that dining room, like being spoken to by someone who actually intended to. When you have time, I would like to hear about those properties from you directly, whatever the transitions are. She was aware, in the fraction of a second before she answered, of something shifting in his expression, not dramatically, not performed, but a slight and genuine quickening, as if her face had answered a question he had been carrying for some time. She did not know yet what the question was. She filed it. There will be time, she said. She gave him her card. He gave her his, plain white stock, name and sole number printed, and a New Orleans number added in ink, by hand, recent enough that the pen had left a slight pressure mark on the card. By hand. She put the card in her bag. She was nearly through the lobby when she heard Damien's voice from the hallway near the coat check. Not raised, Damien never raised his voice, but close enough that when she slowed her steps by a measure too small for anyone watching to notice, his words came to her clearly. The window is still open, he was saying, but we need to move before she finds a new attorney. the timeline is. And then something shifted, footsteps or instinct, or the precise silence that falls when someone realizes they have been heard, and the sentence ended. She collected her coat. She was almost at the door when Rosalie Theroux came out of the dining room and caught her not asking, just moving with the certainty of a woman who had been holding other people together for 50 years and who understood that what was needed at this particular moment was not words but arms. Simone leaned in, briefly. "You are your father's child," Rosalie said quietly. "Every person in that room who has known this family for more than 5 minutes knows exactly whose hand was just shown tonight, and it was not yours." She pulled back and held Simone at arm's length, and her eyes had the particular steadiness of iron that has been tested and found true. "Did you hear about Bernard Fletcher? 3 weeks ago now. Sat down at his desk on a Wednesday afternoon, and that was that. Man always had something unfinished for some client, right up to the very end." She squeezed Simone's arms once and released her. "Pay attention right now, baby. Your father would want you paying attention." Simone said, "The things you say when you are being held up by someone and you need them to know you are going to be all right without quite lying about it." She walked to the parking structure. She sat in the car. She gave herself 3 minutes. 3 minutes for the grief to be real and uncontrolled, and hers for the ring she would not be wearing home. For the 2 years of choosing to believe something that was not true, for the precise kind of wound that comes from being discarded by someone you trusted, while the people you respect watch it happen. She let all of it move through her for 3 full minutes, and she did not perform composure for anyone, because there was no one watching. Then she stopped. She ran back through 2 years and looked at all of it from the angle that the overheard sentence required. The window is still open, but we need to move before she finds a new attorney. Bernard Fletcher, sitting down at his desk on a Wednesday 3 weeks ago and not getting back up. Always with something unfinished. The trust papers she had signed almost a year ago on a morning full of other things because Damien had presented them as a formality, and she had been tired and trusting and not careful enough. The language he had used tonight in front of 40 people: legacy, stewardship, what your father would have wanted, not one word about love, not one word about the two of them as people, the language of a man managing an asset. She thought about the handwritten number on Jisoo Kang's card and what it meant that he had written it by hand rather than printed it, and what it meant that he had turned away from Damien's introduction to speak to her directly. She thought about before she finds a new attorney, before, present tense, a window still open, a deadline somewhere. She had signed a trust document almost a year ago, and she needed to read it again. This time alone, this time slowly, this time with different eyes. She started the engine and drove home, and she did not sleep that night, and she was not troubled by not sleeping, because the thing keeping her awake was not grief, but the precise alertness of a woman who has finally understood what she is looking at and has already started deciding what to do about it. The trust instrument was in the filing cabinet under her father's desk. In the hanging folder, she had labeled protective instruments, because that was what Russell Vance had called the stack of documents he had slid across the conference table almost a year ago. Damien's family attorney, brisker than necessary, certain in a way that made questions feel like interruptions, and she had been in the state she had been in for most of the preceding year, which was the state of a woman who had made a deliberate decision to trust someone and was operating on that decision, and she had signed. She read the trust instrument at her father's desk on the Thursday morning after the dinner. She was not a lawyer, but her father had raised her to read documents the way a careful person reads maps, not for where they say you are going, but for all the places the road could take you that they haven't labeled. Her father had taught her that the danger in any document is not what it says, but what it has been designed to do while appearing to say something else. She found the provision about the management entity. She found the co-signature requirement on major transactions. She found the name Cole Heritage LLC listed as the named management entity, and she sat with that for a long time because she could not specifically remember, could not pull the memory cleanly whether she had registered that name when she signed or whether she had been moving too quickly through the document, because Russell Vance was sitting across from her with the manner of a man who had somewhere else to be. She thought about the sentence before she finds a new attorney. At 10:30, the phone rang. Peter Shim, Kang Pacific's New Orleans operations director, with the measured efficiency of a man who facilitated a great many meetings and understood that the quality of the first 90 seconds set everything else. Jisoo Kang's schedule had opened for the following afternoon. Would Miss Whitfield welcome a conversation? She looked at the trust instrument in her hand. She looked at Jisoo's card on the desk. Tomorrow afternoon works, she said. She called Diane Okafor after she hung up, not for legal advice, yet. Not yet, because she did not have enough of the picture to know what advice she needed, but because she needed to hear a voice that had known her for 23 years and would not require her to manage her expression while she spoke. Diane was an attorney and a line sister, and one of the few people in Simone's life who could be both those things simultaneously without the one diminishing the other. Diane picked up on the second ring. "Di," Simone said, "something is wrong. I don't know the shape of it yet, but something is wrong." "Tell me what you have," Diane said. She told her about the dinner, about the overheard phone call, about the trust instrument. Diane listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Simone had loved about her since freshman year at Howard, the ability to actually listen while another person was speaking rather than preparing your response while they were still in the middle of theirs. "How fast can you get a lawyer you trust to look at that trust document?" Diane said when she finished. "I'm the only person I trust right now," Simone said. "Then you're going to have to read it very carefully," Diane said. "And Simone, whatever you find in there, don't reach out to Russell Vance. Don't contact anyone on Damien's side. Keep what you know to yourself until you have the full picture." "I know," Simone said. "You're going to be all right." "I know that too," Simone replied, though the words felt more like a promise than a fact. She ended the call and returned to her father's desk. In the second drawer was a stack of unopened estate mail she had been avoiding because every envelope still made his death feel recent. She went through renewal notices, tax confirmations, and a neighbor's sympathy card. Near the bottom, on Cream Law Firm stationery, she found a letter from Patricia Goudeau, executor for Bernard Fletcher's estate. It said a sealed personal letter addressed to Simone had been found among Bernard's final professional effects and was waiting for her on Magazine Street. Patricia Goudeau's office was on Magazine Street in a 2-story Greek Revival building that had been a law office since 1912, and the receptionist handed Simone the sealed envelope at 9:15 with the particular gentle care with which people handle things connected to the dead. The envelope was cream business stock, slightly yellowed with 3 weeks of waiting, and Simone's name was on it in Bernard Fletcher's handwriting, not the cramped legal print he used for documents, but the rounder, more deliberate script of personal correspondence. Bernard had been her attorney since she was 22 years old, and he had known her father since before she was born, and she recognized the handwriting, the way you recognize the handwriting of someone who has been a fixed point in your life. For so long you stopped noticing them until they were gone. She took the envelope to her car. She sat in the Magazine Street parking lot with the river 3 blocks away and the envelope in her lap, and she held it for 2 full minutes before she opened it. Bernard had written the letter on a Saturday. He noted the date at the top the way he always did, and every sentence carried the organized quality of a man who had been structuring arguments for 40 years and who chose his words with the same care he had applied to every document that had ever passed through his hands. "Simone," he wrote, "you need to read this carefully and then read it again." He had discovered the problem 4 months before he died. During a routine audit of the Whitfield estate instruments, he had found language in the trust management section that required a second reading and then a third. He had requested original documentation from Russell Vance's office under the cover of a compliance review. He had engaged a colleague who specialized in trust instruments to examine the management provisions without identifying the client. What they found was this: buried in the management section, in language designed to look like standard protective boilerplate, was a clause that said, in essence, if Simone did not file a precise document called a Declaration of Active Management with the local archive within 12 months of when she signed the trust, control of the waterfront parcels would transfer automatically to the named management entity, Cole Heritage LLC. The trust had been executed on October 24th of the prior year. 12 months from that date was October 24th of the current year. Bernard had dated his letter October 15th and underlined the deadline twice. She was reading the letter on Thursday, October 15th. 9 days remained. She read the date again because the first reading felt impossible. October 24th, 9 days. She kept reading. Bernard had also discovered something else, and this was the thing that he had been racing against the clock to confirm before he died. When he examined the trust language about the management entity's rights, he found that the reversion clause referenced something called the parcel's original federal designation. And that phrase, in a private trust instrument, was strange enough to send him looking. What he found, through a maritime history researcher he had hired on a confidential basis, was that in 1887, the United States federal government had placed a permanent protection on that exact corridor of waterfront land, designating it as a federal port interest in perpetuity under post-Reconstruction legislation for developing southern ports. The protection was meant to last forever, unless the federal government itself formally removed it through a precise legal proceeding. That proceeding had never happened. The protection was still there, had been there through every sale, every transfer, every offer to buy. Her grandfather had bought land that had a federal protection on it that nobody in the family had known the name of, but that her father's father had apparently known was there and considered more valuable than any offer. And here was the critical point. The thing Bernard had stayed up late on Saturdays to confirm. A private trust instrument, any private document, cannot override a federal protection. The reversion clause, giving Cole Heritage LLC control of the land, was legally unenforceable against the federally protected interests, because you cannot transfer a federal interest through a private contract. Damien's reversion clause was built on sand, but this only mattered if Simone knew it, and it only protected her from the clock if she filed the Declaration of Active Management before the 9 days were up to put her ownership formally on record and make the reversion clause moot as a practical matter, regardless of the federal question. The last paragraph was written with a slightly different pressure, the way a person writes when the urgency has moved from their mind to their hand. Simone, the deadline is October 24th. File the declaration before midnight. Do not assume Russell Vance will remind you. Do not assume Damien will wait. Do not let Damien's people talk you into anything. Your father told me in 2018 that his father had always said the protection on that land was the reason no developer could ever force a sale. He knew what was there. He held it for you. Now you hold it. One more thing. In my locked archive is a folder marked North Basin 2003. Your father believed the Cole family won that port contract with numbers that did not belong to them. I could not finish that review. Diane Okafor will know what to do with it. Go! She read the letter twice. She sat in the parking lot of Magazine Street in the October morning and she breathed long and steady, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when the situation required more than she had immediately available. 9 days. She said it to herself once, flatly, to hear how it sounded when it was real and not still a sentence in a letter. 9 days. She thought about Bernard in the last weeks of his life, a man in his late 60s working alone against a clock he was afraid he was not going to outrun, and who had written this letter on a Saturday and sealed it and filed it under her name as a contingency because Bernard Fletcher had been thorough about contingencies for 40 years and had not let dying interrupt that. Simone folded the letter, pressed it against her chest, and finally let one sound escape her. It was not weakness. It was grief, rage, and love arriving together. Then she wiped her face, called Diane, and said, "Cancel whatever you have to cancel. I have 9 days to save my father's land." Chapter 2. The Man Who Said Do Not Sign. The next afternoon, with Bernard's letter in her bag and 8 days counting down, Simone drove past the North Basin access road. Her grandfather had assembled the land piece by piece. Her father had held it against 30 years of increasingly generous offers. She had grown up knowing the land was waiting for a reason to reveal itself. At 3 o'clock she arrived at the Bay Quai. Peter Shim met her at the gangway and walked her aboard. The ship's interior was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for the performance of wealth, the kind of interior that announces its own cost from the doorway, and instead, she found something quieter than that. Warm wood, clean lines, light from sources you couldn't immediately locate, a sitting room that faced the water through a full-length window, a table set for two with coffee and a small plate of fruit. Jisoo stood when she came in. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "thank you for coming." "I'll be direct with you," she said, sitting down. "I'm here because I'm trying to understand who's in the room with me and what they want. I am not here to sell." "I know," he said. "Sit, please." He poured the coffee himself, and before he poured hers, he stopped and asked how she took it. And she appreciated the sequence, the reaching for the task, and then stopping to let her be a person in it rather than assuming. "Black," she said. He poured it black and slid the cup across, and there was something almost light in the sequence, the small ordinary comedy of it after the previous 36 hours. She did not smile yet. "Tell me about the North Basin parcels," he said. "Not what is in the current title record. Tell me what you know about their history going back before your family." She studied him. "That's a very precise place to start. I'm a precise person," he said, and it was a plain statement, not a boast. "My grandfather acquired those parcels through the 1940s and 50s, she said. 14 acres, deep water access, an easement on the eastern boundary that was established before anyone in my family owned the land. My father received 3 significant offers to sell in the last 10 years. He declined all of them. Why did he decline? Because he understood what he had," she said. "He didn't always have the precise technical language for it, but he knew the nature of it. He used to say, the land had teeth that nobody had gotten around to counting yet." Something moved in Jisoo's face, quick and genuine, too fast to be managed. She caught it. He did not try to retrieve it. "Your father was right," he said. The federal protection attached to that corridor is old enough and strong enough to change the value in ways a current title search will not show. Simone held his gaze. I learned this morning that the protection exists. What I do not know is why it matters so much to Kang Pacific. There are 2 comparable waterfront parcels within half a mile. Why this one? He was quiet for a moment. She recognized the quality of the quiet, not evasion, but a man deciding how much of the true answer to extend at this stage. The port access configuration on your precise parcels has characteristics that serve the Kang Pacific hub in ways those other properties cannot replicate, he said. The specifics are still being confirmed by my research team. I would prefer to give you the full answer when I have the complete picture. That's part of an answer, she said. It is, he said. I'll give you the rest when I know you better. She looked at him for a moment. You researched my father before you came here, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes, he said. What did you find? I found a man who turned down 3 8-figure offers in a decade, he said. A man who took a significant business loss that was not his fault and absorbed it without letting it be used against him. A man who held 14 acres of waterfront land through 30 years of development pressure with the precise patience of someone who knew he was holding something that had not yet shown its full value. He looked at her steadily. I tried to understand his theory before I came to you because I thought his theory and the land were connected in a way that would matter for this conversation. Were you right? I believe so, he said. I also believe his daughter inherited the theory, even if she has not yet been given all the information she needs to see what it explains. She held that for a moment. She thought about her father sitting at his desk, writing that note in the easement file about the patience of a man who holds something for 30 years because he understands it has teeth. Nobody has counted yet. All right, she said, then let me ask you the question that goes with that. She held his gaze. He held hers. She thought, that is the most honest thing anyone in a professional negotiation has said to me in a long time, including the part where it is incomplete. She was aware that she was measuring honesty by a standard that had recently been set very low, and that this awareness complicated her ability to trust the measurement. Does Kang Pacific have any existing or proposed relationship with Cole Maritime Group or the Cole family? She said. Something changed in his face, slight but present. No existing relationship. There was initial contact. Cole Maritime made inquiries about a co-partnership on the North Basin proposal. I declined to pursue it. Why? Because I prefer to deal with the person who actually owns what I need, he said, rather than the person who is attempting to position themselves as the necessary intermediary. They talked for 2 hours. It was a careful conversation. Two people each thinking 3 things simultaneously and choosing to say one of them. But underneath the carefulness, there was something genuine in the back and forth, the particular aliveness of our conversation between 2 people who are both accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room and who have encountered each other. He asked questions that were precise in the way of someone who had done serious preparation before this meeting. She answered directly without giving him everything. And she noticed that he respected the limits without pushing. Before she left, Peter Shim placed a preliminary memorandum of understanding on the table. It offered Kang Pacific the right of first consultation on port discussions connected to the North Basin parcels. Simone read the first page, reached for the pen, and stopped when Jisoo placed 2 fingers on the document and slid it gently away from her. Do not sign this today, he said. She looked up. It is non-binding. That is what rushed people are always told. His voice stayed calm. Take it home. Give it to an attorney who has never represented me, Damian Cole, or anyone in either family. Mark every sentence you dislike. If we cannot survive your independent review, we should not do business. For one sharp second, pride rose in her. I know how to read a contract. I know, he said. I am not asking you to prove it. I am showing you that I do not need you hurried. The words landed harder than he could have known. Damien had always praised her intelligence while arranging circumstances that punished her for using it. Jisoo was doing the opposite. He was making room for her judgment, even when it delayed his own deal. She put the unsigned document in her bag. At the gangway, he called her name. When she turned, he said, "Your father built something worth protecting. So did you. Do not let anyone make you choose between the two." It was not a negotiating line. She could hear the difference. I am beginning to understand that, she said. She drove home and found the Cole Heritage LLC letter waiting like a threat dressed as routine business. It was certified mail from Russell Vance, printed on Cole family letterhead, informing her in precise legal language that under the terms of the Whitfield Family Protection Trust, any transaction involving the waterfront parcels in excess of $1 million required co-signature from the trust's named management entity, Cole Heritage LLC. She sat down. She sat down at her father's desk with the letter in both hands because her legs had decided the floor needed more of her weight than her body currently did. She read the letter once, and then she pulled the trust instrument, and she read the relevant section again, and this time she read it with the precise knowledge of what Cole Heritage LLC was, and what it meant that Damien's family's entity had been written into the management provisions of a document she had signed, and Bernard's warning became concrete. The letter was not informing her of a rule. It was trying to make her accept the Cole family's authority before she could challenge it. She called Walter Guidry, her father's CPA, a man who had been managing the Whitfield family's books since 1989 and who was constitutionally unable to waste a word. "Walter," she said, "in a trust instrument where a named management entity has co-signature authority on major transactions, how much power does that entity actually have?" "Depends on the instrument," he said. "Could be notification and right of first objection. Could be true co-execution required. If it's co-execution, nothing moves without both signatures." He paused. "Simone, who drafted this instrument?" "Russell Vance," she said. A longer pause. "I don't know Russell Vance personally," he said carefully, "but I would strongly encourage you to have someone who is not connected to whoever recommended him look at that document." "I know," she said. "Thank you, Walter." She set the letter in the filing cabinet. She stood at the kitchen window, looking at her father's backyard, the fig trees, and the banana plants, and the lemon tree that had grown taller than the fence, and she thought about the shape of what she was looking at. Not the whole shape, not yet, but enough of it to understand that she had been positioned. That evening, Jisoo Kong sat in the sitting room of the Baek Hwa with the unsigned preliminary MOU on the table and the river going dark beyond the window. He told Henry Cho to run a complete property history on the North Basin parcels, not only the current title chain, but the original federal record, going back as far as the government had ever been involved in that waterfront corridor. "How far back are we going?" Henry said. "As far as the record goes," Jisoo said. "I need to know what was there before any private owner, and whether any federal interest was formally closed out, or whether it is still technically in effect." Henry left. Jisoo stayed at the window for a long time without moving, looking at the river, thinking about a woman who had walked into this meeting, holding herself together with a precision that told him exactly how much she was holding together and how long she had been doing it. Damien Cole arrived at Whitfield Heritage Properties on Saturday morning, less than 48 hours after the dinner. The short interval told Simone more than patience would have. He was no longer managing her feelings. He was managing a deadline. This was Damien's skill, timing that felt organic, that landed at the exact moment when resistance was lowest and the framing of concern was most credible. Simone understood this now. She had needed 2 years and 1 public humiliation to understand it, but she had it now. Cora had called 10 minutes before he arrived and said, only, Mr. Cole is on his way. He told me not to put the visit on the calendar. Then the line went dead. He came alone, in the kind of casual clothes that cost as much as formal ones and are designed to signal that the person wearing them is not trying. He was carrying 2 things. A manila envelope, he said, contained a copy of the trust instrument for her files. She already had one, and a gray folder. What's in the folder? She said. Background, he said. He set it on the conference table and opened it, without asking whether she wanted to see it, which was the particular presumption of a man who had been opening things that belonged to other people. For so long he had stopped thinking of it as presumption. On Kang, his family. I just want to make sure you have the full picture before you go further with those conversations. He sat down across from her with his hands open on the table, the posture of someone bringing gifts. Your father trusted me to look out for what he built. That hasn't changed for me. There it was again. Your father trusted me. She looked at the folder. Korean newspaper articles with English translations. A criminal investigation, 15 years old, a civil lawsuit, a photograph of Jisoo's older brother being escorted from a building by men who were not there to help him with his coat. This is 15 years old, she said. Some things don't fully resolve, Damien said, warm and careful. I'm not saying stop talking to him. I'm saying know who you are talking to. That's what Gus would have wanted for you. She picked up the folder and closed it. I appreciate the concern, she said. I'll look at this. After Damien left, Simone sat in the conference room for a long time with the gray folder on the table and the manila envelope beside it. She did not need to read the articles again. She had read them once, and that was enough, not because the information was not real, but because the act of delivering it was what required examination. He had chosen to bring this folder to this office on this precise morning. He had chosen these articles, this framing, this language. He didn't want her to stop talking to Jisoo Kang. He wanted her to talk to Jisoo Kang with this information active in her mind, so that the hesitation it created would buy him what he needed, which was time. She opened her laptop and searched Kang Pacific, not the old articles, but the company itself, what it had built in the decades since the investigation, how its governance had changed, what it had done with the years that had followed the worst ones. The record was there, and it was readable, and it told a different story than the one in that gray folder. 15 years was long enough for a company and a person to either become something different or reveal that they never would. The Kang Pacific record suggested the former. She put the gray folder in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. Then she drove to the marina. Jisoo was in the second deck conference room when she came aboard, with his team arranged around a table of technical site diagrams. He looked up when she came in, said something brief in Korean, and his team filed out with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that when certain things happened in their principal's expression, the meeting was over. She set the gray folder on the table between them. He picked it up. He read through the articles slowly, without hurrying through them, without performing a reaction in either direction. When he set the folder down, he was quiet briefly, the kind of quiet that is working, not avoiding. My older brother ran a division of the company, he said. I was 28 when I understood the full scope of what he had been doing. The criminal association was real. The civil liability was real. My father was dying and did not know. He looked at her directly, without the layer of professional management that he kept on most things most of the time. I spent 8 years unwinding it, paying back what could be paid back, restructuring what could be restructured, closing what could not be saved, cooperating with every proceeding that required cooperation. The investigation in that article ended in a settlement. No family member was charged in connection with the Organized Crime Association, because by the time the investigation concluded, that association had been severed for 4 years. I have every document from every proceeding. I will give you all of it if you want it. She believed him, not because he was persuasive. Persuasion required managing the listener, and he was not managing her. He was simply speaking, but because there was no extra effort in what he said. People who are managing a story put energy into it. He put energy into the story of what he had done after the 8 years of unwinding, not into making the initial failure sound better than it was. All right, she said. There's more you want to ask, he said. Why this parcel, she said. I have asked you twice, and you have given me the same partial answer. I need the real answer. I need to know what you know about this land that I don't, and why it cannot be replaced by the 2 comparable properties available right now within half a mile of it. He was quiet. She watched him working something out, not whether she deserved the answer, but whether he had reached the point where withholding it was causing more damage than the risk of giving it. My research is not complete yet, he said. Jisoo. She said his name and watched him register it, a slight shift in his breathing. I have a trust document I signed almost a year ago that gives Damien Cole's family entity co-signature authority on my property. I have a dead attorney's warning in my bag and 7 days left on a hidden deadline. I have a man sitting across from me telling me half a story and waiting to see whether I will settle for half. She kept her voice even, not cold, not loud, just present. I am running out of people who are willing to be straight with me. Something changed in his face then, not the micromanaged professional shifts she had been watching, but something that moved from deeper than that. He put his hand briefly, flat, on the table between them, and then removed it. It was not a gesture he had planned, and she thought he knew it. 48 hours, he said. Give me 48 hours. When my research is complete, you will be the first person I tell, before my board, before anyone, and it will be the whole answer, not part of it. He held her eyes. Can you give me 48 hours? She held the silence for a moment. I can, she said, but I want to be clear about something. Whatever you tell me in 48 hours, that is not a negotiation. That is you telling me the truth about what you know, and then we decide from that point whether there is anything to negotiate. Understood. She stood. She put the gray folder back in her bag. She had started for the door when she stopped and turned back. One more question, she said, and I need a plain answer. He waited. Do you think my father knew what he had? Jisoo was quiet for a moment. Yes, Ted, he said. I think he knew exactly what he had. I think he held it for 30 years waiting for the right moment, and I think he trusted that you would understand it when you needed to. She walked out. She sat in the marina parking lot for 10 minutes and told herself that 2 people being careful in a situation that warranted caution was not the same as being deceived, and she believed about 60% of that. She drove from the marina directly to Whitfield Heritage Properties and let herself in through the side entrance. The office was quiet. She went to the back office, the one that had been her father's, before she took over operations, and she pulled the property files on the North Basin parcels, the original title chain going back to her grandfather's first acquisition in 1947, and the easement documentation on the eastern boundary that she had reviewed once, years ago, and had not thought much about since. She sat down and read the easement file. It was old and technical, mixing federal regulatory language with local port authority language in a register she could only partially interpret without more background, but she understood enough to see that the easement on the eastern boundary had been designated under federal authority in the late 1800s, and that it had been maintained and transferred in every subsequent title document accepted by every new owner without being extinguished, and that she could not find anywhere in these files a document that explained in plain terms what that federal designation actually meant, or why it had persisted through 130 years of ownership changes. She found, paper-clipped to the last page of the easement file, a handwritten note in her father's blocky, precise handwriting. She recognized it immediately. He had written it on the yellow legal pad paper he always used for personal notes, in the ink pen he kept on his desk for 30 years, in the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write by someone who believed it mattered. She looked at the date at the top of the note, 2018, 8 years ago, when she was still learning the business beside him, when she had sat in this same office asking him questions about the properties, and he had answered her with the patient specificity of someone who intended to transfer not just ownership but understanding. He had known then. He had written this note in 2018 and put it in the back of the easement file where anyone who came looking, anyone who took the time to go through the documents carefully rather than accepting the summary, would eventually find it. He had not told her directly, had not sat her down and explained about the federal protection. Maybe he had not found the right moment. Maybe he had thought there was more time. Maybe he had trusted that she would find it when she needed to, the way his own father had apparently trusted him. She thought about what it meant to hold something for 30 years on the strength of trust. Trust in the land itself, trust in the people who would come after you, trust that the right thing would present itself at the right time if you were patient enough to let it. Her grandfather had done that. Her father had done that. And Bernard Fletcher, sitting down at his desk on a September Wednesday, with the confirmation from the Federal Records Office still fresh and the letter already sealed, had done it too. She read the note. Then she read it again, alone in her father's office, and she read it aloud into the quiet room the way you say something aloud, when you need to hear it outside of your own head. Bernard says the protection on this land goes back further than anybody's paperwork, says it is the strongest thing in the whole package, and that Daddy's daddy knew it was there and never told a soul. Do not let anyone pressure you on this. She stood in the quiet office with that note in her hand, and she thought about her father writing that sentence and filing it in the back of the easement folder where he knew she would eventually find it. And she thought about Bernard Fletcher sitting down at his desk on a Wednesday 3 weeks ago and not getting back up, and she thought about the sentence before she finds a new attorney. She photographed the note. She photographed every page of the easement file. She stood in that back office for a long breath with her phone in her hand and the photograph of her father's handwriting on the screen, and she thought about what it meant that he had put this here, not on his desk, not in a letter to her, but in the back of the technical easement file, where only someone who went looking carefully would find it. He had trusted her to go looking carefully. He had trusted her to know that when someone told her the land was just land, and she should accept whatever they were offering, she should instead open the back of the technical files and see what was actually there. She put the file back exactly as she had found it. She left the back office with photographs of her father's note and 7 days remaining. In the parking lot, she called Diane again. I found Daddy's handwriting in the easement file, Simone said. He knew the protection was there, and Bernard left a second trail, a folder marked North Basin 2003. Do not touch the original folder without me. Diane said. Photograph what is visible, lock the building, and go home. My flight lands tomorrow night. Damien called before Simone reached the highway. She let the call go to voicemail. His voice came through warm and controlled. Please do not burden a new attorney with a simple family matter. Russell has handled everything properly. We can still resolve this without embarrassment. Embarrassment. He had ended their engagement before 40 people, but independent counsel was the embarrassment he feared. At home, Simone cooked red beans even though she had no appetite. Her mother had taught her that feeding the body was a refusal to let pain make every decision. She stirred the pot until the smell filled the kitchen, then set the spoon down and gripped the counter. Her hands began to shake. The ring was still in her purse. She pulled it out, tried to place it on the table, and dropped it. The stone struck the floor and spun beneath her father's chair. That was the moment her control broke. She sat on the kitchen floor in her charcoal trousers and cried with both hands over her face, not because Damien had left her, because she had allowed him to use her father's name as a key, because every time she had questioned a document, he had kissed her forehead and said, "Let me carry this for you." Because grief had made help feel holy, and he had recognized the opening. A knock sounded at the back door. Rosalie Theroux entered with a covered dish, saw Simone on the floor, and put the dish down without asking permission. She sat beside her. "I let him use Daddy against me," Simone said. Rosalie took her hand. "No, he used your love for your father against you. That shame belongs to him." Simone told her about the trust, the deadline, and the federal protection. When she mentioned the 2003 folder, Rosalie's expression changed. "Your father came to my house the night the coal company won that contract," she said. "He had bid lower. He had stronger numbers. But somebody inside the Port Authority gave the Coles information they should not have had. Gus never accused them publicly because he could not prove it. He carried that loss like it was his failure. Bernard was looking into it," Simone said. "Then finish what those men started," Rosalie replied. "Not for revenge, for the record." After Rosalie left, Simone opened her notebook and wrote 4 lines. Save the land. Protect the evidence. Trust Diane. Make Damien answer in public. At 11:43 that night, an email arrived from an address she did not recognize. It contained one sentence. Check the sender address on the federal removal application, then compare it with the Executive Assistant Archive for Coal Maritime. Under the sentence was a scanned scheduling page. Cora Bennett's initials appeared at the bottom. Simone stared at the screen. For the first time, she understood that someone inside Damien's office had decided silence cost more than truth. Chapter 3: The Clock. Diane Okafor landed in New Orleans on Sunday evening with 1 suitcase, 2 legal pads, and the expression she wore when somebody had mistaken kindness for weakness. 6 days remained before the October 24th deadline. Simone met her at the airport, and Diane did not begin with legal questions. She pulled Simone into a long embrace and held her until Simone stopped pretending she was fine. In the car, Diane said, "Tell me the part you have been leaving out." Simone kept her eyes on the road. "I loved him. I know. I signed because I loved him. I was tired. Daddy was gone, and Damien kept saying he would carry the things I did not have strength to carry. That does not make you foolish. It makes him calculated. It still has my signature." Diane turned toward her. "Then we are going to put your signature on something stronger." They worked at Simone's kitchen table until after midnight. Diane reduced the problem to 3 sentences. Simone owned the land. The trust tried to move control to Coal Heritage if she failed to declare active management by October 24th. The federal protection meant the Coles could not take the most important rights, but Simone still had to file before the deadline to keep them from dragging her through years of litigation. So we file, Simone said. We file with proof so complete that no honest clerk can misunderstand it, and no dishonest lawyer can bury it. The next morning they entered Bernard Fletcher's old office. Patricia Goudeau unlocked the archive room and left them alone with the files Bernard had marked before his death. The first folder contained the property deeds, the trust drafts, and his correspondence with Russell Vance. The second carried the handwritten label, North Basin 2003. Diane opened the trust draft first. A yellow note was attached to a page that had later disappeared from the final version. Bernard had written, "Client must receive independent counsel before execution." Beneath it was an email from Russell Vance. Damien believes independent review will create unnecessary delay. Simone is comfortable with the family arrangement. Proceed without separate counsel. Simone read the sentence twice. I never told him I was comfortable. Then that email is not a misunderstanding, Diane said. It is a record of a lie. The federal file was worse. Cole Heritage LLC had applied months earlier to remove the old federal designation. The application had been rejected because only Simone, as the legal owner, could request removal. The sender line used an address from the executive office of Cole Maritime. Cora's anonymous message had told them where to look, and now the paper proved why. Damien had not proposed marriage and later discovered the land. He had studied the land, built a legal path toward control, and then made himself the man Simone trusted most. Simone stood so quickly her chair struck the wall. She walked to the window, pressed both palms against the frame, and tried to breathe. Diane did not tell her to calm down. She let anger have its rightful size. He sat at Daddy's table, Simone said. He ate my food. He asked me what song I wanted at the wedding while his lawyer was trying to erase the protection. Say the rest. He did not leave me because I failed him. He left because the plan was almost finished. Yes, and he humiliated me in public so that everybody would think any decision I made afterward came from heartbreak. Yes. Simone turned from the window. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Then I want the truth in the same room where he told the lie. Diane closed the file. First we save the land, then we choose the room. The North Basin 2003 folder gave them a second line of attack. Augustus Whitfield had bid for a major port services contract against Cole Maritime. His price was lower. His staffing plan was stronger. Yet the Cole proposal had contained exact language from confidential questions Augustus submitted during the sealed process. Bernard had found a fax log showing that someone at the Port Authority sent the Whitfield questions to a number registered to Cole Maritime 2 days before final bids were due. There was not enough in Bernard's folder to prove a crime by itself, but there was enough to reopen the record. More important, there was a note in Augustus's handwriting. I lost more than a contract. I lost faith in a man I called brother. Do not make Simone carry this unless proof is found. Simone sat down. For the first time since the dinner, she cried without limiting the minutes. Diane moved beside her and rested an arm across her shoulders. Daddy thought protecting me meant keeping the pain from me, Simone said. Parents do that. But it also kept me from knowing what Damien's family was capable of. Your father made the best decision he could with the proof he had. You get to make a different decision with the proof you have now. They copied every page, created a digital archive, and placed the originals back in Bernard's locked room. That afternoon, Diane drafted the Declaration of Active Management in plain language. Simone affirmed that she actively managed the Whitfield parcels, that no private entity could claim automatic control, and that the federal port protection remained attached to the property. On Monday, 5 days before the deadline, Damien sent flowers to Simone's house. The card said, We should not let outsiders destroy what our fathers built. Simone placed the flowers in the trash. Rosalie retrieved the vase first because, as she said, bad men do not get to ruin good crystal. On Tuesday, 4 days remained. Russell Vance filed a notice claiming Cole Heritage had to approve any document related to management. Diane read it once and smiled without humor. He is trying to make the clerk afraid of accepting your declaration. Can he stop it? Not legally. Procedurally, he can waste time. That is why he waited until now. On Wednesday, 3 days remained. Diane submitted the declaration electronically. The system returned it with a red flag requesting proof of concurrent notice to Cole Heritage. Diane called the archive office and explained that a declaration of ownership was not a sale, transfer, or transaction. The clerk agreed, then said the matter had been escalated to a supervisor who would respond within 5 business days. 5 business days was 3 days too late. On Thursday morning, 2 days remained. Simone and Diane went to the notarial archive in person with 2 binders and a certified copy of the federal designation. Gerald Trahan, Damien's litigation attorney, was already there. He greeted Diane as if they had arrived for lunch. There is no need to make this adversarial. Diane placed the binders on the counter. Your client created an adversarial instrument and hid the deadline. We are only making the record accurate. Trahan turned to Simone. Miss Whitfield, grief and recent personal events may be influencing your judgment. Mr. Cole remains willing to protect the property while emotions settle. Simone looked at him. Tell Damien my emotions have settled into evidence. The supervisor refused to accept the filing that morning, not because Trahan was right, but because he wanted written guidance from the parish council. Diane requested an emergency review. The answer was promised by Saturday. Saturday was the deadline. That night, Jisoo called Simone. She nearly ignored it, then answered. I heard there is a filing dispute, he said. Who told you? The port liaison. I did not ask for details. Good. He accepted the boundary without resistance. Do you need anything that I can provide without entering the dispute? She looked at the binders covering her father's kitchen table. I need people to stop asking whether I need to be rescued. Then I will not ask again. There was a pause. But I will say this, he continued. You are not alone just because the decision is yours. The distinction reached her. Thank you. On Friday, 1 day remained. Cora sent a second email. This one contained copies of calendar entries, internal messages, and a voice memo transcript. The earliest message was dated 2 months before Damien first approached Simone at the museum auction. Russell Vance had written, the Whitfield reversion is workable if she signs before retaining new estate counsel. Damien replied, I can manage the relationship. Keep the federal issue out of the summary. Another email, sent the week before the public dinner, said, the window remains open until October 24th. If she seeks independent review, we lose control. End the engagement before questions become formal and frame all contact as protection of the Whitfield legacy. Diane read the emails and leaned back. Cora just gave us motive, planning, and his own words. Will she testify? She says she will if we protect her employment records and preserve the originals. Simone closed her eyes. She remembered Cora standing behind Damien with a tablet, always efficient, always overlooked. Women like Cora saw everything because powerful men trained themselves not to see them. Saturday arrived. The deadline was 11:59 that night. At 9 in the morning, Parish Council issued a written opinion. The declaration did not require Cole Heritage approval, but when Diane attempted to file, the electronic portal went down. The archive office announced it would close at 4:30 and reopen Monday. Diane stared at the notice. That failure is convenient. Can we prove someone caused it? Not today. We do not need to. Louisiana still recognizes an in-person date stamped filing. We get paper into the hands of the authorized custodian before midnight. The authorized custodian was attending a parish records conference in Baton Rouge and was not expected back until evening. Diane reached him through 3 attorneys, a retired judge, and one woman from her sorority who seemed to know every public servant south of Interstate 10. At 7:14, the custodian agreed to meet them at the archive building at 10:30. Rain began at 9. New Orleans streets filled fast and traffic slowed to a crawl. Rosalie drove ahead of them, calling from her car whenever a route flooded. Sister Ida called the archive custodian and reminded him that Augustus Whitfield had donated the first computers used by the neighborhood legal clinic. Marcus Pruitt sent a written opinion supporting Diane's interpretation. Patricia Goudot arrived with Bernard's original letter sealed in plastic against the rain. At 10:26, Simone and Diane reached the archive entrance. Gerald Trahan was waiting under the awning. The custodian should not accept a disputed filing after business hours, he said. The office is accepting a filing before a statutory deadline, Diane replied. You can challenge it Monday. Tonight you can step aside. Trahan did not move. Simone walked toward him until only the width of the document box separated them. You told Russell Vance I was comfortable without independent counsel. You knew that was false. Cora preserved the email. Step aside, or your name becomes the first name in tomorrow's complaint. For the first time, Trahan's professional calm cracked. He moved. At 10:43, the custodian examined Simone's identification, the deed, Bernard's letter, and the federal record. He stamped the declaration. The sound was small. One metal strike against paper. It was the loudest sound Simone had heard all week. The filing became effective at 10:44, 1 hour and 15 minutes before the deadline. Simone placed her hand on the stamped page. She did not celebrate immediately. She closed her eyes and saw her grandfather buying the first narrow strip of waterfront with wages saved from work that had damaged his hands. She saw her father turning down offers nobody understood. She saw Bernard returning to his office while dying because he had one more letter to finish. Then she whispered, I see it, Daddy. I see why you held it. I have it now. Diane squeezed her shoulder. Rosalie began to cry. Sister Ida lifted both hands and said, Lord, thank you for letting the truth arrive before midnight. Across town, Cora placed the public confirmation on Damien's desk. He read Simone's name, the timestamp, and the federal designation. His face emptied. Who helped her? He asked. Cora looked directly at him. The people you assumed would stay invisible. At the marina, Henry Cho handed Jisoo a copy of the filing. She found the protection, defeated the notice challenge, and filed with 75 minutes left, he said. Jisoo read the page twice. The feeling that came over him was not surprise. It was respect sharpened by regret. He had spent weeks protecting himself with partial answers. Simone had spent 9 days walking directly toward the truth. The land was safe. Now the lie had to be answered in public. Chapter 4. The same room. Damien's first response was a demand for a private meeting. Gerald Trahan sent it Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after the filing. The message said, the Cole family wished to resolve all misunderstandings confidentially and preserve the dignity of both families. Simone read it at the kitchen table while Diane drank coffee across from her. Confidentially, Simone said. He humiliated me in front of the alliance, but he wants the truth behind a closed door. Diane set down her cup. Then do not give him the door. The New Orleans Black Business Alliance was scheduled to meet at the Pontchartrain Club on Monday night. Simone asked Marcus Pruitt, the Alliance Counsel, for 15 minutes on the agenda to address a matter affecting the integrity of the organization. Marcus had already seen the public filing. When Diane sent him Bernard's letter, the 2003 records, and Cora's preserved emails, he called Simone personally. "You will have the room as long as you need it," he said. Damien learned about the agenda that afternoon. He tried to cancel the meeting through his father. When that failed, he called Commissioner Harold Fontaine and asked him to characterize the dispute as a private family matter. Fontaine declined. The federal removal application carried the name of a Port Authority contact, and he had begun calculating his own exposure. On Monday evening, the private dining room looked almost exactly as it had on the night Damien ended the engagement. The same chandelier scattered light across white tablecloths, the same portraits watched from dark walls. Many of the same 40 people sat in the same chairs, but the room did not belong to habit anymore. It belonged to attention. Simone wore a deep blue suit her father had bought her when she closed her first independent property deal. Diane sat at her right. Rosalie, Sister Ida, Patricia Goudot, and Walter Guidry occupied the row behind them. Jisoo was not present. Simone had not invited him. This was not a billionaire rescuing a betrayed woman. This was a daughter correcting the record of her own family. Damien entered with his father, Russell Vance, and Gerald Trahan. He smiled at people who did not smile back. Cora came in last and took a seat near the door with a document case on her lap. Marcus opened the meeting. Tonight's agenda concerns the use of alliance relationships in a private trust arrangement, a pending port matter, and possible misconduct affecting members of this organization. Miss Whitfield requested the opportunity to present facts. She has it. Simone stood. "The last time I stood in this room," she began, "Damien Cole told you my father trusted him with the Whitfield legacy. He used that claim to end our engagement and to suggest that I was not capable of protecting what my family built. I thanked him for the clarity. Tonight I am returning it." No one moved. She placed one page on the screen behind her. It was the trust clause, enlarged until the language could be read from the back of the room. 11 months ago, while I was still grieving my father, Russell Vance presented this trust as routine protection. The document contained a hidden deadline. If I failed to file a declaration of active management by October 24th, control of 14 acres of Whitfield waterfront land would move to Cole Heritage LLC. Damien's family controlled that company. I was never advised to seek independent counsel. In fact, the record shows they worked to prevent it. Russell shifted in his chair. Trahan leaned toward him and whispered something. Damien rose. "Simone, this is a distorted reading of a standard estate instrument. The management clause existed to protect you from predatory buyers." "Sit down," Sister Ida said from the second row. The room turned toward her. She folded her hands in her lap. "You had your uninterrupted speech the last time. Let the woman finish hers." Damien sat. Diane stood beside Simone and explained the law without hiding behind legal vocabulary. The declaration was an owner's notice. It was not a sale, a transfer, or a partnership. Cole Heritage had no lawful power to approve or block it. More important, the land carries a federal port protection that no private trust can erase. Cole Heritage attempted to remove that protection months before Simone knew it existed. The application failed because only the true owner could request removal. A copy of the failed application appeared on the screen. The sender address belonged to the Executive Office of Cole Maritime. Marcus looked toward Damien's father. Was the alliance ever informed that a member company was seeking control over another member's inherited property? The elder Cole did not answer. Damien stood again. Kang Pacific has manipulated this situation. A foreign billionaire appeared the same night our engagement ended, and now Simone is repeating his legal theory as if it were her own. Everyone in this room should ask who benefits. Simone had expected the attack. She let the accusation settle until the room heard its ugliness. Jisoo Kang did not file my declaration, she said. He did not pay my attorney. He did not find Bernard Fletcher's letter. He did not locate my father's note or the federal record. He was not in the archive when the document was stamped. Diane Okafor and I did that work. Rosalie Theroux helped me stand when grief tried to put me on the floor. Patricia Goudeau protected Bernard's files. Marcus Pruitt gave an independent opinion. Sister Ida made sure a public servant remembered his duty. The people who saved the Whitfield land are the people you treated as background. A low sound moved through the room. Not applause yet. Recognition. Simone turned toward Damien. I have one question. Answer it directly. Did you begin a relationship with me because you loved me, or because Russell Vance told you the trust plan required my confidence? Trahan rose. My client will not answer a defamatory question in a public forum. Then perhaps he will answer his own email, Diane said. Cora stood. For 2.5 years, she had entered rooms carrying Damien's schedules, his passwords, his private instructions, and the documents he assumed disappeared when he closed a laptop. Now she walked to the front with the case held against her side. My name is Cora Bennett, she said. I served as executive assistant to Damien Cole. I preserved these records because I was instructed to delete them. After Miss Whitfield began asking questions, I refused. The originals have been delivered to counsel and copied to an independent forensic examiner. Damien stared at her. Cora, you are violating confidential business records. No, Cora replied. I am reporting evidence of fraud. Diane placed the first email on the screen. It was dated 2 months before Damien met Simone at the museum auction. Russell Vance wrote, Whitfield remains emotionally exposed after her father's death. Independent counsel is the only serious obstacle. Damien replied, I can establish trust. Draft the instrument so the management transfer appears protective. The second email was dated the week of the public breakup. The window remains open until October 24th. If she finds a new attorney, we lose control. End the engagement before questions become formal. Keep the message focused on legacy and her father's wishes. The exact language Damien had used in the room now appeared behind him in his own correspondence. Patricia Bordeaux covered her mouth. Commissioner Fontaine looked down. Walter Guidry removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, the way he did when anger required a task. Simone asked again, Did you love me, Damien? He looked at the emails, then at Cora, then at his father. His silence lasted long enough to become an answer. I cared about you, he finally said. That was not the question. The relationship became real. After the plan began, he had nothing. Simone felt the last private hope inside her go still. Some part of her had wanted him to deny it convincingly, not because she believed him, but because the heart can remain loyal to a version of a person long after the mind has buried him. His silence finished what the dinner had started. She removed Damien's grandmother's ring from a small velvet pouch and placed it on the table between them. You did not choose me, she said. You selected access. Keep the symbol that helped you sell the story. Damien's father rose. This performance has gone far enough. Augustus Whitfield and I built business in this city together. He would be ashamed to see his daughter destroy 30 years of relationships over language in a document. Rosalie stood before Simone could respond. Augustus came to my house in 2003, believing he had failed his workers, she said. He did not know your company had received his confidential bid questions. He blamed himself for a theft your family hid behind friendship. Do not use a dead man's shame as protection from your own. Diane displayed the fax log, the bid comparison, and Bernard's notes. The evidence showed that Whitfield Heritage had submitted a lower bid, and that Cole Maritime used confidential language received before the deadline. Cora then produced an internal memo from the Cole archive, referring to the 2003 advantage and warning that the original fax records should never be digitized. The elder Cole sat down. Commissioner Fontaine cleared his throat. The Port Authority has received these records. Effective this morning, the Licensing Oversight Office has opened a formal review of the 2003 award and the recent federal removal application. Any current Cole Maritime requests connected to North Basin are suspended pending review. Damien looked at him with disbelief. Harold, you knew our fathers. Fontaine's face tightened. That is exactly why I should have asked more questions sooner. Marcus Pruitt returned to the center of the room. The Alliance bylaws prohibit members from using confidential relationships, organizational access, or deceptive instruments to obtain control of another member's assets. I am moving for the immediate suspension of Damien Cole and Russell Vance from all Alliance committees pending investigation. The motion received a second from Patricia Bordeaux, then another from Walter Guidry. The vote was not close. Damien's suspension passed 34-2. Russell Vance's passed 36-0. The elder Cole did not vote, neither did Commissioner Fontaine. After the count, the room remained silent. Simone had imagined applause, outrage, perhaps even shouting. What came instead was more powerful. One by one, people who had spent years looking toward the Cole table turned their chairs away from it. Damien approached Simone while the meeting broke into small conversations. You did not have to destroy everything, he said. She looked at him without anger. Now, I did not destroy it. I stopped protecting it. My father will lose contracts. People will lose jobs. Then tell the truth early enough to save the innocent people who work for you. That is what leadership would look like. His voice dropped, and Kang walks away with the land. No, the land stays mine. Any company that works there will do so under terms I approve, with community protections, local jobs, and independent oversight. You still cannot imagine a woman owning something unless a man is standing behind her. That is why you lost. Cora joined them. Damien turned on her. You will never work in this city again. Simone stepped between them. Cora will work for Whitfield Heritage as Director of Compliance beginning Monday if she wants the position. Her employment council has copies of every threat you make from this point forward. Corva's eyes widened. I want it. Damien looked from one woman to the other and understood there was no private person left for him to intimidate. Sister Ida approached Simone after he walked away. How do you feel, baby? Simone considered the question. Sad, relieved, angry, free. That sounds like truth, Sister Ida said. Rosalie wrapped Simone in both arms. Diane joined them, then Cora, then Patricia. The embrace grew into a small circle of women, in the same room where a man had once expected Simone to stand alone. At the far end of the dining room, workers began clearing the untouched place settings from the Cole table. Simone looked at her father's old friends, at the women who had spoken when silence would have been safer, and at the ring still resting beneath the chandelier. The first time Damien used that room, he took her future and narrated it for her. The second time, Simone returned with facts, witnesses, and her own voice. She left the ring on the table. She took everything else with her. Chapter 5. What she chose to keep. 11 days after the Pontchartrain Club confrontation, Peter Shim called with the measured regret of someone delivering a decision he had not made and did not endorse. The board has identified a governance concern, Peter said. Under Kang Pacific's conflict of interest standards, a director with a developing personal connection to a transaction counterparty is required to recuse from that transaction. Mr. Kang has formally recused. The transaction will be paused pending reassignment to a subsidiary, which will conduct its own due diligence. She thanked Peter Shim. She hung up. She sat at her father's desk, and she thought about what it meant that Jisoo had let this happen, had not managed around it, had not found a way to keep himself in the deal while technically complying with the governance standard. She thought about a man who had spent 8 years rebuilding a company's integrity piece by piece, and who had, when the test came, chosen to take himself out of a $380 million opportunity rather than manage around a real conflict. She thought, that is a man who has decided what kind of person he wants to be, and he made that decision before he came to my door. The hospitality contract renegotiation with Marguerite Fontenot at Second Line Community Kitchen took 45 minutes and ended with an agreement both of them could build from, smaller in initial scope and with expansion options written into the following year. Marguerite did not ask why the timeline had changed. Simone did not offer. They shook hands at the end of the call, and Marguerite said, "We're going to do something good with this, Miss Whitfield," and Simone believed her. Jisoo came to her office on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the recusal. Without his team, without calling ahead, he was in a dark coat she had not seen before, and he was carrying 2 paper cups from Café du Monde, with the plastic lid pressed down over the powdered sugar that had already found its way onto his coat sleeve. She came to the door herself and looked at him and the coffee and the powdered sugar on his sleeve, and something in her chest that had been holding itself at careful distance made a decision without consulting the rest of her. "Come in," she said. He handed her one of the cups when she stepped back to let him through. "I did not know how you took your coffee," he said, "so I went with beignet on the side." He held up a small paper bag, also from Café du Monde, also with powdered sugar already escaping from it. She took the bag. She looked at the powdered sugar situation on his sleeve and coat front. "You walked here?" she said. "From the marina," he said. "That's almost 2 miles. I needed to think," he said. She led him to the sitting area, and they put their cups on the table, and she went to the kitchen for napkins. And when she came back, he was standing at the window that faced the street, looking out the way people look out windows when they are organizing what they need to say. "The board made the right call," he said when she sat down. "I want to say that first, before anything else. The conflict was real, and they were right to enforce the standard." "I know," she said. "Sit down, Jisoo." He sat. "I want to tell you what I should have told you on the ship," he said. "The reason I could not tell you then is the same reason I'm going to tell you now, and I want you to understand both parts of that." "All right," she said. "The federal protection on your land, the 1887 designation, is not just a historical curiosity. Under the specific classification it falls under, any commercial shipping operation that establishes a formal partnership with the federally protected corridor receives an exemption from modern port development fees. In this region, those fees run approximately 12% of annual operational costs. Over the 20-year projected lifespan of the Kang Pacific Hub, that exemption is worth approximately $380 million in savings. There is no substitute property within the viable hub footprint. Your land is irreplaceable. He said it plainly, without the performance of revelation. I did not tell you, because knowing the number would have given you a negotiating position I was not prepared to hand over at the stage we were at. I told myself this was standard practice protecting proprietary valuation from a counterparty. That was partially true. And the other part, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The other part, he said, is that I had already decided I wanted to know you, not just do a deal with you. Know you. And in my experience, deciding that in the middle of a transaction makes you vulnerable in ways that are hard to manage. So I managed the information instead. He looked at her directly. That was not honest. She held that for a moment. Jisoo, she said, why did you walk 2 miles with powdered sugar falling on your coat to tell me this tonight? The deal is paused. There's nothing to negotiate right now. Because I did not want to be someone who only showed up when there was something to negotiate, he said, and because I spent the last 3 weeks watching what you did, finding what you needed across 9 days with a dead man's letter and nobody confirming the path for you, and I kept thinking about your father's note in those files and the way you read it out loud in that empty office. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked back at her. You didn't tell me about the note, he said. How did you know about the note? I didn't, he said. I imagined it. I imagined someone who received the kind of filing you made, working that fast on that margin, and I thought about what it would feel like to find your father's handwriting telling you not to let anyone pressure you on something he had held for 30 years. He paused. Was I close? She looked at him for a long time. You were close, she said. The room was quiet. Outside, New Orleans was doing what New Orleans did in the evening, that layered, living sound that never quite stopped, horns and music, and the particular smell of the river coming through the old walls of this building. There is a governance clause, she said. Your board identified a developing personal connection. If anything becomes personal here, the subsidiary handles the transaction, he said. Not me. I am not on the deal. He met her eyes. I am here, which is not the same thing as being on the deal. You walked 2 miles, she said, in a good coat, he said. Or it was a good coat. She looked at the powdered sugar situation again. She picked up her coffee cup. I have a question, she said, and I need the plain answer. I know, he said. That is becoming the pattern of our conversations. She looked at him for a moment. What is it like, she said, to know that you left $380 million on the table to come here tonight? He thought about it. It feels like the right number, he said. The $380 million is still there. It will close through the subsidiary. That is not what I left on the table. He picked up his coffee cup. What I left on the table was the option of continuing to manage this at a careful distance. I was very good at that distance. It was well organized. What changed? You filed a declaration with 75 minutes left, he said, using research you did across 9 days with a dead man's letter and your own father's handwriting on a yellow notepad. And you didn't call me. You didn't need to call me. And I sat on the Bake Hawa that evening, thinking about a woman who had been handed a 9-day window and a dying man's notes, and no one to confirm the path, and I understood that I had been protecting myself from someone who did not require protection in the way I had been treating her as though she did. He put down the cup. I had been careful with you for the wrong reasons. She held that. Do you understand, she said, that I have spent the last several weeks learning to trust my own reading of things again, after 2 years of trusting someone else's reading of everything, and that what that means practically is that I move at the pace I move at, and I do not skip steps because someone with a very nice coat walked 2 miles to my office. He looked at her. Yes, he said, I understand that completely. Good, she said. She reached across the table and took one of the beignets out of the paper bag. Powdered sugar immediately went everywhere. Then stay and tell me about the 8 years. All of it, not the version you give to people who need to be managed. He stayed until 10 o'clock that night. They talked about his brother and what those 8 years had actually looked like from inside them. Not the version that appeared in restructuring documents and legal settlements, but the version of a man who had stood in his father's hospital room and understood that his father was going to die without knowing what his other son had done, and who had made a decision in that room about the kind of life he was going to build from that point. He talked about soul and the specific geography of a city that had been rebuilt entirely within living memory, and what it means to grow up somewhere that carries its own reconstruction in its bones. She talked about her father and the particular grief of inheriting what someone built and only gradually understanding the full weight of what they had been carrying while they built it. She talked about New Orleans, the specific quality of this city's relationship with its own history, the way it holds on to things that other cities would have let go of long ago. She talked about the land not as an asset but as a thing with a history, a thing that had been held by a chain of people who had understood something about it that they could not always name. When Jisoo stood to leave at 10 o'clock, she walked him to the door. He stopped in the doorway, coat still carrying evidence of the walk from the marina, and he said, "Whatever the deal becomes, and it will become something, the subsidiary will reach out next week. I wanted you to know who I am before we got to the terms. Not what Kang Pacific needs. Who I am." "I know who you are," she said. "I've been watching." He smiled, not the professional courtesy of the terrace at the Pontchartrain Club, but the actual expression of a man who has been surprised into something genuine. She filed it carefully. "Same time next Tuesday," he said. "Bring better coffee," she said. "The coffee is excellent," he said. "It's the transport that needs improvement." She closed the door. She stood in the front room for a moment in the quiet. Then she went to the kitchen and washed the 2 cups, and she thought about all of it: the dinner, the parking garage, Bernard's letter, 9 days in a file room, Damien's silence when she asked him the question, her hand flat on her father's table, and she thought, this is what paying attention looks like. This is what your father wanted. 6 months later, on a Wednesday morning in April, the Kang Pacific North American Hub Agreement closed through Kang Pacific's Louisiana operations subsidiary. Simone had negotiated the final terms herself across 3 rounds, with Diane reviewing each iteration, and the agreement gave Whitfield Heritage Properties a partnership stake in the hub's operational structure in exchange for long-term access rights under the federal protection, a structure her grandfather, who had bought this land with 20 years of careful savings, might not have recognized in its technical details, but would have known in its essential shape, the shape of something worth holding being held by someone who understood its value. The 2003 bid records, Cora Bennett's preserved emails, and Russell Vance's federal removal application were submitted to the New Orleans Port Authority and the Federal Inspector General. Within a month, 2 coal maritime licenses were suspended pending review. Damien resigned from the Black Business Alliance Board before the members could remove him, and his father was asked to step away from 3 civic committees. Russell Vance's law firm placed him on leave. The formal investigations would take months, but the public consequences arrived immediately. Damien Cole had not been seen at the Pontchartrain Club since the night Simone left his ring on the table. On the day the agreement closed, Simone drove to the North Basin parcel. She had called Rosalie the night before, and Rosalie had apparently called 3 other people, and when Simone arrived, there were 6 women from the community standing at the edge of the waterfront access road in the April morning light. Rosalie and Patricia Bordeaux and Marcus Pruitt's wife Angela and sister Ida Young and 2 younger women Simone recognized from the alliance, but did not know well yet. Rosalie was holding coffee she had clearly stopped somewhere to get, and Sister Ida had a small bouquet of yellow flowers that she pressed into Simone's hands without explanation when Simone got out of the car. "Your father," Sister Ida said, and that was the whole sentence. Everything that needed to be said was in it. They walked together to the edge of the waterfront, where the land her grandfather had bought was bounded by the old concrete retaining wall, and they stood there in the April light, with the river moving in front of them and the city behind them. and the freight vessels on the far channel, and a pelican tracking something near the surface with the patient attention of something that has learned that patience is the whole skill. Jisoo was already there. He was standing at the far end of the retaining wall, looking at the water, and when Simone came to stand beside him, he did not say anything for a moment. He had a cup of coffee from a place she recognized, not Café du Monde, and he handed it to her, and she took it. "It closed?" she said. "It closed," he said. They stood together at the edge of the land her grandfather had bought with 20 years of careful money, the land her father had held against 30 years of offers and pressure, and the slow, quiet grief of a business rupture he had blamed on himself and had not deserved, the land that had a federal protection placed on it by the United States government in 1887, and that had never been touched by any force since then, not the offers, not the trust document, not Cole Heritage LLC's attempt to erase what was there before Simone knew what to look for. The light came down gold and flat across the water. Rosalie was laughing at something Patricia had said, somewhere behind them. "She's going to throw those flowers in the river," Jisoo said quietly, meaning Sister Ida, who had moved to the edge and was standing with her bouquet. "That's exactly what she's going to do," Simone said. "She did the same thing at my father's funeral." "What does it mean?" Simone thought about it for a moment. "It means she's finished with what happened," she said. "It means she's letting it go to the water, and the water takes it wherever it's supposed to go." They watched Sister Ida throw the yellow flowers into the river. They watched the flowers catch the current and move south, turning slowly in the water that her grandfather had stood beside 70 years ago and decided was worth buying land next to. The city was behind them. The river was in front of them. The sun was on the water. "Same time next Tuesday?" Jisoo said. Simone looked at the river for one more moment. "Yes," she said, "and you're bringing the coffee."